Good afternoon, everybody. Hello, I'm Associate Professor James Connor, and it's my pleasure to welcome you to the Public Sector Research Group's Things Worth Sharing seminar today. First, I just want to acknowledge that I and UNSW Canberra is on unceded Ngunnawal land, and as an ally, I want to pledge my own support for the Uluru Statement from the Heart and the process of Makarrata, the coming together after a struggle. Now, today, our aim is to showcase some of the work being done in the Public Sector Research Group. We have 4 presenters today, and they're going to introduce us to some really interesting work that they've completed over the last few years as part of their work on the public sector in general. Please drop your questions into the chat. We will return to those at the end, plus the presenters may engage with you in that chat as well, in a written format, as well as the verbal one towards the end. Each presenter is only going to talk for a brief amount of time, so we've got plenty of space for engaging with these ideas as well at the end. Without any further wasting of my time, let's get straight into our first presenter, and that is Professor Helen Dickinson, and she'll be speaking about disability policy. Helen.
Okay, good morning, and thanks for joining us today. So I'd like to acknowledge that I join you from the unceded sovereign lands of the Wurundjeri people and pay my respects to elders past and present. So I'm going to talk today about a number of pieces that I have in the Things Worth Sharing book relating to disability policy and practice. So this is one of the main areas of research that I've been working on for the last few years. And it's safe to say that many of us who are active in this space went into 2021 pretty tired from the various challenges that COVID-19 had raised in 2020. In the initial pandemic response, people with disability were largely forgotten, and there had to be a lot of work done to get attention to this at-risk population and develop an effective response. And it's been another busy year this year. Not only have we had the continued response to the pandemic, and once again, we've found that people with disability were overlooked within that. But added to that, we've seen a number of changes proposed to the National Disability Insurance Scheme, including one that's currently being debated in the Senate that gives the Chief Executive of the NDIA unprecedented powers to change individual plans, and many of us share concerns about that. But what I'm going to do in the next 10 minutes or so is talk you through some of my year in research and advocacy with respect to disability policy and practice. It won't include everything, but it'll give you a bit of a flavour, and also some of the fantastic people that I've had the pleasure to work with along the way. So we ended 2020 with talk that there'd be a new process introduced to the NDIS known as independent assessments. And so the government told us that we needed these because the NDIS was not running in a way that was completely fair. And I've written about this issue of inequities in the NDIS for some time. So I was really pleased to see that we might have something that would address those inequities, although I was rather dismayed by the proposed solution. And to me, it seemed that the proposed solution wouldn't make the NDIS more fair, but it probably more likely to further entrench inequities in the scheme. So what was being proposed was a new way of assessing the functional impairment of all people who are eligible for the scheme. And at the moment, this is done by individuals getting their own health professionals to give them reports about their impairments. And it can sometimes be quite expensive, particularly if you have to use the private system. And this new system would be the same for everybody, and all eligible people would go through an independent functional assessment undertaken with the same range of clinical tools. This would be done by a professional who wasn't known to the individual, because the government argued that where clinicians know individuals, they're more willing to be generous with their assessments, and that's problematic. And many in the community argued that a 3-hour assessment with a stranger isn't enough to understand the strengths, limitations and goals of an individual. And also many people found those processes highly stressful, and they could be quite inaccurate with what they found. And so one of the big concerns was that this change was actually being driven by a desire to cut costs in the scheme and would leave a number of people without sufficient funding. And the process of designing and trialling the process was also criticised because it was very rushed in terms of the consultation and lacked a co-design element with people with disability. So from early in the year, I wrote a number of pieces for things like The Conversation and the Canberra Times, and did a number of radio slots as the kind of debate about those changes raged. And one of the great things that we saw through this process was we saw academics, people with disability, advocates, and a number of other people coming together to educate those not familiar with the NDIS about the proposals and the challenges of these, and also what some of the potential alternatives might be. The NDIA Trials, the independent assessment process, and with Anne Kavanagh of the University of Melbourne, we explored what those trials showed. And although it was reported by the agency in quite a positive way, when you drill down in the findings, they're not actually as positive as they might immediately look. And also, really importantly, the evaluation approach that was used didn't actually tell us whether independent assessments worked or not. So they were basically a simple kind of satisfaction survey about the process, but the participants weren't told what impact the assessment had on the size of their package. So they couldn't tell us what impact it had on plans, and many people in the disability community were concerned about that because they saw them as a cost-saving initiative. And finally, in July, the government announced that independent assessments would be shelved. It became apparent that they didn't have enough support to pass these. And so we were really hopeful that the lessons of the need for co-design and sufficient time for consultation would be learned. Although, as I mentioned previously, there are some changes being debated at the moment that have been released with a really short consultation period and are certainly not co-designed. But we were pretty happy in the middle of the year to see these changes halted, although conscious that more changes would likely be proposed. So the government continues to argue that the NDIS isn't financially sustainable, despite the fact that less than a year ago its own report showed that it was on track in terms of its budget. And also the data and assumptions that have been used to argue for the unsustainability have not been publicly released. So we'll continue to closely analyse the scheme through various different data sources. And I think it's also worth saying that while the NDIS has its challenges, it's something that Australia should be immensely proud of. And for some people, it's absolutely life-changing. And I guess what many of us would like to see happen is that that life-changing experience be extended to all participants of the scheme. So one of the things that many people with disability were concerned about in the pandemic context was that if there became a shortage of health resources, because we saw a surge in cases, that people with disability would be deprioritised. And there's really good reason for this concern. There's a significant evidence base that shows that people with disability are discriminated against in the health system. Julian Troller and colleagues at the UNSW have done some really important work that shows that people with intellectual disability die on average 27 years younger than the average life expectancy. And all too often that's because of entirely preventable issues. Training for health professionals on disability issues is done in a really inconsistent way, and many health systems are inaccessible to people with disability. In 2020, we avoided some of the surges in cases that we saw in other countries where health systems became overwhelmed and where decisions had to be made about how to prioritise resources. So things like ventilators and ICU beds, and many of the different processes that systems around the world used to prioritise that care discriminated against people with disability because of assumptions that were made about individual impairments and quality of life of individuals. And so with colleagues at Curtin University and the University of Birmingham in the UK, we did some research asking about 1,500 Australians how they'd like to see health resources prioritised if there was pressure on those. And what we found was a significant subset of the respondent group deprioritised people with disability, and people with intellectual disability were more deprioritised than people with physical disability in terms of accessing health resources. And that's regardless of people's ability to benefit from treatment or whether they were health workers or have dependents. And so we saw a large number of people willing to discriminate on disability basis. And so we argued that there needed to be work to be done to ensure that people with disability wouldn't be deprioritised if we saw an increase in cases again, which of course we have done since then across a number of states and territories in the second half of this year. Now, as I said at the start of the pandemic, one of the things that we saw was people with disability were not considered by government as being a priority group. And it was some months before that was rectified, and we lost some time in developing an effective response. And so many of us were really heartened to see the government put people with disability and their workers in the priority group for vaccination. So these groups were supposed to be fully vaccinated by April, but as Anne Kavanagh and I wrote about at the end of April, just 6.5% of residents in disability care homes had been vaccinated. And aged care residents and First Nations people were also faring poorly within that. And so we were really concerned that at that time, that as vaccinations opened up to over 50s, that those prioritised groups would be forgotten. And sadly, our predictions came true. We heard in a Royal Commission hearing into the abuse and neglect of people with disability that the government had actively deprioritised people with disability in favour of older Australians. And in late August, Anne, myself and Nancy Baxter wrote that with public health measures set to be lifted when the vaccination rate for people with disability and First Nations Australians was lagging the general population rate in really significant ways. So in late August, just 27% of NDIS participants and 11.6% of First Nations Australians had been double vaccinated. And it wasn't always easy to find these figures because the government wasn't routinely reporting these at the time. So we argued that lifting public health restrictions when the general population got to 80% vaccinated, as many states and territories had said they would mean that we would reopen with the general population more vaccinated than those groups who've been prioritised. And remember, we prioritised these groups precisely because they were at more risk due to COVID. And while the government said that access wasn't an issue and hinted that it might be a case of vaccine hesitancy, work that myself, Sophie Yates and Catherine Smith did with the advocacy organisation Children and Young People with Disability Australia found many parents reporting a number of challenges in securing an appropriate vaccination process for their child or young person. And sadly, we don't know what the impact of all of this has been in terms of illness and deaths of people with disability, as there isn't a common routine indicator of disability in health data like we see in other countries. So we've got a bit of a sense of which NDIS participants have contracted COVID, but we have to remember that only about 10% of people with disability in Australia receive services and funding under the NDIS. So as we come to the end of the year, it's clear that there's a lot to do still in terms of advocating for realising the human rights for people with disability. But what we've learned this year and has been really powerful is that when academics align with people with disability and advocacy organisations, we can really help to shine a light on some of these issues and to successfully challenge some of them and really celebrate where the successes lie. So that's it for me for now. Thank you.
Thank you, Helen. And just a reminder for everybody watching, please drop questions into the Q&A. We'll deal with those towards the end of our presentations today. Now we're moving on to Dr. Adrian Bazbauers, who's going to talk about the challenge of developmental banks and whether they're actually a good thing or not. Adrian.
So the best way to start with this, I am Dr. Adrian Bazbauers. I myself am speaking today, but the work I'm going to be discussing, or the majority of the work that I'm discussing, was done in partnership with Associate Professor Susan Engel of the University of Wollongong. And it would be wrong for me, of course, not to bring up the fact that Susan and I collaborated the last few years on a major project, which I'll discuss. And we are continuing to collaborate on a few spin-off research projects related to this. But over the last decade or so, I have been fascinated by the multilateral development banks. The best way to think about these, if you haven't had much experience with the MDBs, they are multilateral, meaning that they are owned and controlled by states, by governments, more than three, being the definition for multilateral. So they are public entities. They focus on development, and by that I mean international development, typically related to the idea of economic development, poverty reduction, and greater social inclusion. But as we move along, it's far more focused on economic development broadly. And the last item from the MDB, they are banks. They lend finance, provide loans, provide grants, provide guarantees. They engage with sovereign loans to the public sector, and they also finance private sector activities. Now, there is a vast literature on the MDBs within global governance research, within international relations, within international public sector management. But Susan and I working together over the last few years, what we did realize was that there was far less discussion about what are all these banks together as a network, as a system operating together. Typically, research on these MDBs focus on individual organizations, standalone entities. This bank is doing this bank is doing that, but never trying to put them together. So what we tried to do, turn to this next slide just here, in our book, which came out at the beginning of this year, The Global Architecture of Multilateral Development Banks, a System of Debt for Development, we look at 30 MDBs, or 30 functional MDBs, and much to our concern, we did find a 31st after we published this book that was hidden away from our view, but there are 31 functional MDBs currently operating around the world today. And I really do mean around the world. There are banks stationed in the United States, throughout Western, Central, Eastern Europe, throughout the Middle East. There are quite a few throughout Sub-Saharan Africa, East African banks, South African banks, African Development Bank, which serves the continent. And there are numerous banks operating in Asia Pacific and in Latin America and the Caribbean. These are global undertakings operating at the global level, at the regional level, and at the sub-regional level as well. They very much differ in size, scope, and operations. Some of these banks are approving $80, $90 billion a year. Other banks are approving 2 or 3 million a year. So there's vast differences between what they're capable of. But what Susan and I found really interesting about them was the fact that there is 30 of them, or 31 now, but let's pretend there isn't. There are 31 of these functional MDBs operating. But to date, most discussions have focused on 2, 3, 4, or 5 of them, ignoring a vast percentage of these banks and what they're doing, particularly since a lot of these banks that have not been observed in great detail are often quite more niche in focus and are often operating in less developed parts of the world and are actually owned and operated by less developed parts of the world without the influence of the United States, without the influence of the OECD. So we were interested to look at this as a system. How do they relate together? How do they connect together? And going back to what James said right at the start, are they a help or a hindrance at the end of the day? Are they leading to good outcomes, or what is actually going on? And going through this, we looked at roughly about 150 years of history. These banks first emerged about the 1940s, but we looked at about 150 years of international history to understand the evolution of economic and development thinking, and then position the emergence of these banks within that system. And over that time, different, let's call it economic orthodoxies, have arrived and have disappeared over time. The old favorite of Keynesianism came and went between the 40s and 70s, the rise of neoliberalism in the 1980s onwards, and the very, very interesting era of retro-liberalism that we currently have over the last 10 years. And I've got a lot to say about that, but I'll say that for Q&A if you like. But trying to make sense of these banks in these systems. And what we did find more than anything else is that they are incredibly aligned in their behavior. There are large MDBs which first emerged in the 1940s, early 1950s, and they very much lay the blueprint of what came afterwards. So smaller, more niche banks emerging in, say, Southern or Eastern Africa, in the Caribbean, bear the hallmarks of much larger banks that were established by the United States or by Western Europe. But the interesting thing is, despite following the blueprint, their resources are far more conservative operating where they are, which impacts their overall efficacy. It's hard to mirror incredibly influential, powerful, and robust capital-based banks when you have limited resources yourself. So we tried to make sense of this. And one thing we did find going through this, the most successful MDBs, and I say a lot of these ones are quite small, a lot of the most successful ones are ones that are willing to be innovative, to break away from orthodoxy, and to adapt and try to do what they do based upon their particular needs and what their limitations end up making a strength overall. Doing things which much larger, influential international organizations can do quite easily, they cannot, so they try to do things in different ways. And to provide some context to that, I'll draw attention to the screen now. The contents list says climate finance. I'll return to that in a slide in a moment, but I'll point out how niche emergence can emerge in the behavior of these banks. But before I get there, because my slides are actually in a different order, so this book emerged beginning of the year. As Susan and I progressed through the year, just like Helen have been doing, engaging with academic and non-academic audiences to try to promote the research that's being done. Susan and I first wrote an opinion piece for Developing Economics, which is a critical development economics website, providing insights into where the world is today. And we use this as a staging ground to coincide with the emergence of our book. Here's a 1,500-word piece. This is the major takeaways, what the book is trying to achieve in making sense of the MDBs. As the year progressed, I was fortunate enough to be invited by one of the case studies in the book. I did research work, I conducted interviews and spoke to people. The Nordic Investment Bank on the right-hand side of the screen asked me to write a short opinion piece relating to their 45th anniversary, which is quite nice. And it's good to engage with audiences beyond just an academic audience to show how research has utility beyond very, very narrow theoretical debates, potentially. But we emerge along the way. We try to engage with different audiences, really just reiterating some of the main talking points we're all putting forward. But to return to, recognizing I have 2 minutes left, to return to that chapter 10, climate finance, I embarked over the last year, 2 papers have been published from this so far. In chapter 10 of the book, and I was the primary author of chapter 10 because as many of you will know, I'm very, very interested in climate finance work. I decided to take essentially what was one paragraph from chapter 10 and turn it into a series of articles, make it into a larger project. And these particular series of articles focus on the role the MDBs are playing in investing in sustainable, green and climate resilient cities. One paper focuses on financial allocations and what this means. The other paper focuses on analytical work, so the policy work informing investment decisions. So they're part of the same project, but they splinter off and go in different directions. And broader ramifications emerge for me in the context of climate change. But if I bring this back to what the book is about, looking at the MDBs as a network, understanding their alignment, their convergence or their divergence, being organizations in this complex architecture of development finance globally, there is close agreement between the MDBs in how they're approaching climate change and how they're approaching specifically how to make cities sustainable, how to make cities climate resilient. But what really emerged for me in these 2 particular articles, as things move forward with these different banks, as they try to tailor their responses to different situations, they start splintering off in different directions to accommodate their own member countries, the shareholders involved, and the kind of projects that make the most sense in the regions of the world they're operating. So the biggest takeaway then, in the several seconds that I have left, yes, there is a network of MDBs in operation. They are closely aligned in what they're doing. It is very much a follow the leader situation where other banks blueprint themselves on more established banks. But as time has gone on, there have also been divergence between these banks, usually emerging from the smaller ones who have to be far more innovative, have to be far more rapid responding and have the ability to change in order to satisfy their borrowing member countries. And with that, I will leave my presentation there.
Thank you so much, Adrian. Now, in further example of the diverse work that we do within the Public Sector Research Group, next we have Associate Professor Sue Williamson, who is going to answer the extremely important question, at least for me, as to what happened to my lunch. Sue.
Okay, hello everyone. Welcome to our presentation. Okay, let's see here. All right, so yes, today I'm talking about whatever happened to lunch. And this came about because we just don't seem to get lunch breaks anymore. And the other day I was just in Zoom meeting after Zoom meeting, and I thought, when am I going to have lunch? Lunches used to be sacrosanct. Remember, we used to kind of keep 12:30 to 1:30 free, and so to enable people to have lunch. Doesn't happen anymore. And so within the new world of post-pandemic, COVID normal, working from home, hybrid working, my reflections are about whatever happened to lunch. But before we also talk about COVID, let's go back to the start of this year. And as a lot of people might know, my passion in life is gender equality. So I do a lot of work around public sector gender equality, and also have been looking at the future of work, and particularly remote working and hybrid working. But what a year it's been for gender equality. I've had a field day commenting on all sorts of things, which is just fantastic. You might recall way back early in the year, February, March, there was lots of kerfuffle around Brittany Higgins and her allegations of being raped in Parliament House. And that created a huge media storm and considerable community outrage about the ongoing violence against women. And you might recall that there was the March for Justice, which happened in March as well. So there was lots and lots of stuff happening here. And I waded in as well. And you might also remember that Andrew Laming was the politician that was allegedly had abused a couple of women online. And he was pulled up for that, and he was sent off to do empathy training. And empathy training is interesting. And I wrote a piece thinking, speculating whether or not empathy training is a bit of an HR fad. My opinion is that it is. I've looked at unconscious bias training. I've looked at sexual harassment training, and the research shows that one-off training doesn't work. It's worse than not working because it actually embeds the practices. People who are forced to undergo empathy training do the training and they think, okay, done the training, I now have empathy, or I have now addressed my unconscious biases. I don't need to do anything else about it, and I'm all good. And so one-off empathy training is, it's quite useless. And so I wrote a piece about that, which was widely picked up and, sparked lots of conversations, which was fantastic. And then International Women's Day came around in March earlier this year, as it does every year. And I had some reflections around what is there to celebrate. There was this huge outpouring of community conversations, as I was saying, around sexual harassment, sexual assault, violence against women. We had Andrew Laming and Christian Porter with their boys' clubs and their antics. I better watch what I'm going to say because I don't want to get sued. And so there was lots and lots of things happening. And so I wrote a piece around gender equality at that time. That seems like such a long time ago. And then, of course, the pandemic rolled on, and in the ACT at least, we were subjected to another 9 weeks of lockdown. And last year, I surveyed 6,000 public servants with the Community and Public Service Union about how people worked from home during lockdowns. We ran another survey this year. That survey the results are going to be released in February next year. So you can keep an eye out for that one, put that in your diary. The next wave of that research will be released in a few months. But this year, I was very interested in the future of work and the future of flexible working. So I've written about how the public service can be a leader in this area. And we know that public sector agencies are doing lots and lots in this space. They're looking at their working from home policies, their hybrid working policies, but they're also going broader than that and looking at flexibilities. So not just working from home, but also other forms of remote working, such as remote working hubs and activity-based working. And just this week, there was an article around on the Department of Agriculture introducing a form of hot desking. And so agencies are experimenting with different ways of working, and this will be a long-lasting legacy of the pandemic. So even though everyone might not end up working hybridly, different types of flexibility will come to the fore. And so that's what I kind of thought about earlier this year. Of course, I also ruminated on what COVID and working from home and hybrid working can mean for gender equality. At the same time, with colleagues, we conducted a big project for the Tax Office and Home Affairs on the future of work. We did a big literature review. So we reviewed the last 10 years of academic literature on working from home to see what it had said and what the findings were. We also reviewed the enormous plethora of articles coming out from researchers and consultancy, all the practitioner literature, which was a mammoth task. If you're an HR practitioner, it is really difficult to keep up with what's happening. You know, our inboxes are just flooded day after day with emails and reports and all the rest of it. And so we tried to make sense of the emerging trends, and that's they're included in this report, our Future of Work Literature Review, which you can find on the Public Service Research Group's website. It's pretty hefty, but there is a nice short executive summary at the front. So in that literature review, we reviewed the literature around all sorts of things: workplace health and safety, what hybrid and remote working means for managers, for organisations, on and on we went. One of the particular areas that I'm interested in is, as I was saying, the impacts of hybrid working on gender equality. The research is showing that more men than women are keen to go back to the office. Women prefer to work at home. They can balance it with their domestic duties, but it also gives them time to focus on work. And this is, well, it's good in a way, but it's also a worry because it can mean that as employees start to transition back to workplaces, we may find that fewer women are going back. So that's something that organisations need to be aware of. The research also shows that employees with disability like working from home because it enables them to manage their health conditions. So if organisations aren't careful, the workforce could end up of white, able-bodied men. So there are lots of equality issues in around hybrid working that organisations need to be cognizant of as employees start to return to work. Who is returning to work? Who is accessing those offices? What hours are they doing? Who's working from home? And this ties in with all those other questions of what work can be done in the office, what can be done at home, what needs to be done 9 to 5, what can be done outside hours, and then considerations around long hours as well. So all these fantastic questions. And then a couple of weeks ago, I was on a panel with some other people for the Mandarin, and that was really good fun. And I was talking about these issues, and the Mandarin coined this really nice phrase of a remote underclass. And so, yes, I like that a lot. So if we're not careful, there could be a remote underclass as we move into some kind of COVID normal and as employees transition back into workplaces. So they're the main things I've been doing this year. And as we look towards, look, I've got the wrong date up there. See, I'm mired in this year. As we look towards 2022, or maybe I just can't believe that it's almost 2022. Anyway, as we look towards next year, I've got a few thoughts. One of them is, has gender fatigue set in? So I have researched gender fatigue in public sector organisations, and I've written a piece about this. I've written lots about gender fatigue, including academic articles as well. Has gender fatigue set in, or will we see some progress? With an election coming up, I'm going to be paying very close attention. Does gender get a look in, or has it been done? There was some amendments to the Sex Discrimination Act that went through recently. in response to the Human Rights Commission report, Respect at Work. The government's position on that was very widely criticised as not doing enough and not implementing the Human Rights Commission's recommendations fully enough. So the government has enacted some legislative amendments. Is that the end of what's going to happen around gender equality? Has gender fatigue set in? What are organisations doing? I know that the Australian Public Service is refreshing its gender equality strategy. The last one ended in 2019. I'm hopeful the new one will be coming out shortly, and I'm fascinated to see how APS agencies will implement the initiatives contained in that strategy and how they will monitor them. So if anyone wants to work on this, give me a shout. The Australian Public Service is also going to be required to report to the Workplace Gender Equality Agency. And this was one of the government's commitments in response to the Human Rights Commission's report on sexual harassment. This is a really positive move forward, and I've been calling for this for years. There is no reason why the APS shouldn't have to report to the Workplace Gender Equality Agency. The government has agreed with me, which is nice, and the APS from 2022-23 will start to report. So we'll probably see those reports coming out in 2023, but agencies will be gearing up to work out how they can meet their reporting obligations. So that is really interesting. And then the future of flexible working, as I was talking about, this has so many interesting aspects. How do employees transition back to work? How do organisations manage this? Do they schedule people back in? Is it staggered times? Is it rosters? How do you make sure that the people who go back into the office aren't doing the office housework and the grunt work that the people at home obviously can't do? What are the impacts on productivity? What does it mean for teamwork? How do hybrid teams work together? Can you get the same level of cohesion? How do managers manage hybrid teams? What happens to employee engagement when you've got some people in the office and other people working at home? And of course, what does all this mean for gender equality, for the work that women do and men and families? So there is a whole lot of fascinating research questions that I'd love to get my teeth into. And then most importantly, and here we are at lunchtime, whatever happened to lunch? Thanks, that's me.
Fabulous, thank you, Sue. Next up, we have Dr. Megan Evans, who's going to talk to us about nature-related financial risks in environmental law. But before I throw to Megan, I just want to congratulate her on being named the ACT Young Tall Poppy of the Year by the Australian Institute of Policy and Science in recognition of her research excellence. Well done, Megan, and over to you.
Thanks so much, James. And thank you, everyone, for having me here. And I'm really, delighted to share some of the work that I've been sharing in public forums over the last year. I guess perhaps a bit of an introduction to what I do. I'm broadly interested in environmental policy and economics, as well as governance. And I primarily focus on biodiversity conservation, as well as, and how that, I guess, intersects with climate change policy. So, one key intersection is, the use of what are now being called nature-based solutions or land-based carbon offsets. So growing vegetation to sequester carbon. Vegetation obviously is biodiversity and has implications for wildlife. So that's kind of where my research sits. And I'm currently funded by a 3-year DECRA fellowship, which broadly aims to understand the role of the private sector in biodiversity conservation. That's essentially what I'll be talking about today. So this article here in the conversation was, I guess, because I'm still, about halfway through my DECRA fellowship now, so I'm still kind of in the data collection phase. This article is really just a series of initial observations about what I've been seeing in terms of this apparent increased interest from the private sector in biodiversity loss and biodiversity conservation. So it was kind of commenting on some trends in terms of, for example, there's large banks looking at raising a fair bit of capital to invest, or financial capital to invest in natural capital, whatever that means. But there's also, I guess, some contradictions in that they might be looking to raise $1 billion to invest in natural capital or biodiversity conservation, but at the same time they spend billions and billions on supporting projects that are actually harmful to biodiversity and the climate. So in this article, I kind of described a few observations, and the first being, I guess, stating the obvious, which is the private sector is going to act in the private interest. And that has implications for biodiversity conservation, I think, because not all components of biodiversity are necessarily amenable to your standard kind of positive financial return and being able to assign a clear percentage expectation of a financial return. So I'll give you an example there. So it would make sense, for example, to invest in a fast-growing, fairly certain kind of measure, like a monoculture of forest. But a monoculture isn't necessarily a good thing for biodiversity. Whereas something that's highly threatened or perhaps grows very slowly isn't necessarily going to be particularly amenable to private sector investment. So that actually points to one reason why I think there's still a clear role for the state or for governments to invest in these natural assets, which are largely public goods. So that was my second key point, in terms of, the government still has a big role to play, both in terms of investment. That's not just my opinion, it's also something that's repeated throughout this fairly large grey literature that's been appearing online, and that me and my colleagues are actually analysing. So in 2020 or 2021, 2020, there were about 90 reports released, broadly talking about, private sector, financial sector, business, biodiversity loss. And, most of them point to a clear role for government, both in terms of providing initial public investment to de-risk private investment, as well as ensuring that there's clear and coherent and aligned rules and policies and regulations to actually incentivise nature protection. So that was that article there. And then there were a couple of other, I'll just mention this one here. This report from government actually only came out, I think last week or the week before. So, and this is, I guess, one of the concerns that I have about this growth in interest in private sector investment is I think it kind of provides a bit of an opportunity or a bit of an incentive for government to kind of see it as a bit of a get out of jail free card, in that, oh, well, the private sector is going to take care of that now. Government doesn't need to do anything. That's obviously a simplification, but I think it's a risk that academics like me working in this area need to monitor and be aware of. So this report, it came out with a press release from the minister, and it came with an investment of $650,000 looking into improving metrics and measurement systems, which it's not nothing, but it's also, we've also got a really chronically underfunded basic regulatory infrastructure with environment in Australia and internationally. And this is cheating a little bit. This is an article that came out last year, but here I kind of make the point, and this was around the same time as that announcement that, government's going to be looking into natural capital investment. I was kind of making the point that we can't expect the private sector to want to invest in something when, the Australian Environment Department relies largely on paper records, like hard copy records, to actually keep track of environmental conditions of approval. We've got really, really poor regulatory infrastructure. So I guess I was essentially arguing that the government kind of needs to get its own house in order before we can expect the private sector to see natural capital and biodiversity conservation as a good investment. I guess coming again to not a related issue, but this was an article that I co-authored with some colleagues, kind of preempting the next phase in the federal government's focus on threatened species. So there was a threatened species strategy that's been a 5-year plan that broadly aimed to identify and prioritise investment into particular threatened species. And generally speaking, that plan wasn't super effective, partly, or at least in part, due to it's just not enough financial investment. So the analysis, or the report from the threatened species strategy, the midterm report, found that only about 1/3 of the priority species had improving trajectories, and that doesn't necessarily mean that their total population, there was actually recovery. It just meant that they weren't declining as quickly as what they were previously. So it still suggests that there's a massive need to invest in threatened species recovery, bearing in mind that on the Environment Protection and Biodiversity Conservation Act legislation, national environmental law, we've got about 1,900 individual species and ecological communities that are in need of conservation attention. And that's reflective of not just Australia's incredible biodiversity that has occurred because of geological events and historical isolation for millions and millions of years, evolutionary distinctiveness, but also we're really bad at keeping them alive. Essentially, Australians are kind of a world leader in species extinctions. It's not a good look for a developed and well-governed country. So we suggested some improvements. The previous strategy focused primarily on cats. Cats were kind of, feral cats are obviously a big threat to threatened species, but it kind of overlooked more systemic drivers, which were habitat loss, which is the #1 issue for biodiversity in Australia. We also recommended, there needs to be a formal prioritisation process, which is, and actually one of the things that they did take up, but they kind of also overlooked the need for government leadership, coordination, policy alignment, as well as substantial investment. There has been work that has come up with an estimate of how much money would actually be needed to recover all of our 1,900 threatened species and communities, and that's been estimated about 1.7 billion per year, which sounds like a lot when you think about it, but then also consider that comparison, Australians spend about $13 billion a year just on pet food. So we could actually do a fair bit with that money. This was the new strategy that came out a couple of months ago. And they announced some funding, which was great. They announced that there's going to be, there's a yellow line. Oh, here we go. They announced $10 million to accompany the new plan to support 100 priority species, which is great. But when you divide 10 million by 100 species, it amounts to about $10,000 per species, which is not really gonna get too far. And there's been some ongoing analysis from the Australian Conservation Foundation of budget papers, which essentially shows that environment spending has, as a proportion of overall budget spend, has been in consistent decline, and it's actually getting worse over time. So it's important to put these announceables in context. I believe I'm out of time, so I think I am going to just leave it there. But I do have, as you can see, a lot of things worth sharing. But I'll end there, and we can perhaps have a broader chat. Thanks.
Thank you so much, Megan. And I am just so impressed by the work done by my colleagues in the Public Sector Research Group, and just the diversity of work and the amazing impact that they are having. Now, if you have questions for us, please drop them into the Q&A, but I'm going to start us off with a bit of an open future thinking question. And my question that I want our panelists to address is where to now, where to next for the research, for the policy impact, and for the advocacy. And we might jump to Helen first and just run down our list of presenters in that order.
Thanks very much, James, and thank you for your chairing today. You've done a great job. So in terms of where next, we've been lucky to get some funding from the NHMRC from a recent synergy round. So we're going to have a big project starts next year that looks that works with colleagues at a number of different universities nationally and internationally, and tries to look at what sorts of interventions might improve mental health outcomes of young people with disability. So we'll carry on working on that. Still some work around the COVID response, including ongoing attempts to encourage a consistent health identifier for disability that gets collected in data. So there's some fairly terrifying figures when we look at other countries. We find that 6 out of 10 people who died of COVID in the UK were people with disability, but we don't have the same sort of data set here. And without some of that visibility, without some of that measurement, it's really difficult to kind of point to some of those issues. So we'll continue to argue for kind of consistent data collection. And I was very struck by Megan's equating of the amount of money spent with the amount of money spent on pet food. And so I need to come up with my own comparison of that as well. But yeah, lots of exciting research for this year ahead.
Thanks, Helen. Adrian?
I was thinking about this in terms of where to next. With the research I'm doing, the ongoing research moving forward, given that I like to look at organisations, that's what I'm doing, looking at organisations and how they interact together. And once again, I was inspired by Megan's wording of things. So I was thinking about this and writing some notes down. My thinking is moving forward with my research to understand how effectively organisations are performing. We need to look at the forest and the trees. We need to be able to look at organisations individually in terms of what they're doing, but we also need to understand them in terms of the broader material, normative and institutional ecosystem. Once again, I'm going to maintain the focus on ecosystems there. The material, normative, institutional ecosystems in which they operate. So we can observe an organisation individually. This organisation does this, it invests this much, it has influenced this in this way. But at the same time, to really understand what that organisation is, the role that it serves, and therefore understanding the effectiveness of it, we need to understand that organisation amongst the ecosystem of other organisations that interact and inform what it does as it informs them. That's my thinking moving forward, what more work could be done, particularly in my field.
Thank you, Adrian. Sue?
Okay, so I ran through earlier things that are coming up that I'm interested in and hopefully we'll be having a look at. I think the big takeaway really is that flexible working is really opening up, and organisations, public sector organisations, are experimenting. So it's going to be more broad than just working hybridly, and it will also be more granular. So as organisations had to go into lockdown and employees were mandated to work from home, it was all really reactive. So I'm really keen to see what is emerging out of that, what lessons have been learnt with public sector organisations, and what they're going to do going forward to embed the good practices and build on those, and how work and the way people work and the implications for equality as they emerge throughout the next year.
Megan?
Thanks, James. Yeah, so the thing that I didn't quite have time to share in my main session, I guess, in terms of where my work is going to be going, kind of what Sue mentioned, there's going to be still a bit of reactive stuff, but also some, I guess, longer form and you know, deeper research. So, you know, some of the reactive stuff is going to be kind of identifying some you know, contradictory policies and approaches that are occurring. So one of the things that happened this year is that in New South Wales there was a announcement of we're going to have 0 extinctions in our New South Wales national parks, which was actually a great announcement. But then very, very quietly, no announcement, at the same time I think it was the same week or the week just after, there was a new clearing code that came out that would allow rural landholders in New South Wales to clear up to 25 metres of vegetation within their property boundaries without any kind of permit or oversight. Now that's a huge contradiction, and the idea that we're only aiming for zero extinctions in protected areas is also kind of harking back to a bit of a kind of fortress conservation kind of approach that has is just not you need to do conservation across the whole landscape. So there's some reactive stuff going on there, but also I'm really keen to look forward to doing some more deeper data collection next year, some interviews and surveys, trying to get a handle on what is this apparent increased role for the private sector in biodiversity conservation. How does that potentially change who does conservation, for what purpose, and how do those different roles and responsibilities change, and how what are different organisations and institutions' perceptions of their role? Because at the moment, I feel like the private sector thinks government needs to do something, and the government is thinking that the private sector needs to do something. So we're at a little bit of an impasse. But yeah, lots more to do.
Thank you, Megan. Now, we are almost out of time, but there is one more question quickly thrown into the chat there. And does the panel think that the last 2 years have allowed for a greater culture of risk-taking and faster decision-making in response because of COVID-19? And will that make a difference in the future? This is your 15-second answer, each of you.
I think that's a great question. And I guess one of the things I would say is, if we look at the literature around interagency collaboration, for example, what we do find is often people are able to make that work in emergency situations where something needs to be done in a really kind of timely way. And I guess COVID has facilitated that to some degree. It would be really interesting to see whether we go back to the mean. And I guess in terms of Sue's work and some of the stuff that she's doing around flexible working, while we see some organisations who are starting to embrace change, there's a remarkable ability to go back to doing what we were doing before. But I'll throw it open to the others for their quick answers as well.
I'm willing to jump in and be completely pessimistic. Currently working on a couple of papers surrounding development finance and financing of gender-based projects. One of the largest multilateral development banks in the world, in the midst of COVID-19, did not approve a single gender-based project for 14 months. So I do like to believe there will be alterations in the way that organizations do things, but it does seem like when things get tough, a lot of organizations revert back to the bread and butter of infrastructure and what is easy, as opposed to really progressing and seeing how a new normal can emerge out of this. So sorry, Sue, that must have been a really depressing thing given your research to highlight, but that's something that was really shocking to me, that over 14 months, not a single project with an identifiable gender component from one of these large organizations. So I'm very pessimistic.
Yes, we know, thanks Adrian, we know that during times of crisis and austerity that equality issues are the first things to go, first things to get shafted. I've had a bit of a look at the crisis literature, trying to predict whether the changes that have occurred in the last couple of years will stick or not. Generally, the literature says that for big changes to become embedded, there has to be an enormous shock. Introducing new ways of working through little crises, it won't stick. You can't introduce new ways of working through a change management program, for example. So my question really is, has COVID been a big enough shock to facilitate widespread changes? And I would tentatively say, yes, it has.
I'll just very briefly say that I haven't looked into whether COVID has affected environmental public agencies much explicitly, but based on what the funding that's been announced post the Black Summer fires, there hasn't really been proportionate response to that kind of really quite massive environmental catastrophe from at least I think probably federal and state agencies at the moment. So interestingly, whether or not there's the COVID situation has had an impact on the private sector in terms of how it perceives crises and shocks, that's an open question for me.
Thank you, folks. I just want to acknowledge the fantastic work that Sue, Helen, Adrian, and Megan are doing and sharing that with us today. Of course, all of our work and research is available on our website, the Public Sector Research Group website there, and all of our contact details. Feel free to get in touch with us if you want to engage with us more. Thank you for listening to this seminar and engaging with us. Goodbye.